My name is Josh Blackwell, and I teach here at Pratt in the Department of Social Sciences and Cultural Studies. I'm also an artist, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about my own work, what it is that I do when I'm not here. First off, I wanted to thank Carolyn Shaberly and CSDS, as well as my colleague in the department, Carl Zinring, for inviting me. So, first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to reimagine this image as not necessarily an image of maybe disgust, but as an image of luxury, okay? I want you to think about maybe the world that we live in as a disposable world, but a world in which that disposability is a kind of index of the affluence of the society that we all share. So to that end, I am really interested in sort of thinking about disposability, excess, waste, in sort of the terms of pleasure. All right? Do that? Okay. So here's a lovely image of pleasure, right? This is a plastic bag, obviously. Plastic bags are the second most common form of litter in the world after cigarette butts. They are ubiquitous. They are everywhere. We can't really get away from them. And this is a picture from my neighborhood here in Brooklyn. Very sort of typical kind of scene. And again, one thing that I like to think about in my kind of life as a sort of resident of this neighborhood is how I kind of move through this sort of world of industrial, economic, political kind of excess and affluence, and how that kind of becomes part of my world. How do I internalize that? About, I guess it's now nearly 10 years ago, I was doing an artist residency in London, and I was living on a very sort of restricted budget, and I needed to make work within sort of limited means. And one of the things that was available to me were these plastic bags, these objects. And they seemed really interesting for a couple of different reasons. They were interesting to me because of the way that, number one, they were everywhere and yet sort of invisible, right? Taken for granted, not necessarily noticed, not necessarily very deeply considered, other than as a kind of nuisance, right, as a problem. And they were also interesting to me because of the way that they bore this resemblance to a garment. And indeed, in the industry of plastic bags, this shape is called a t-shirt bag because of its resemblance to a garment, to a shirt. And because my own background, I guess, comes out of a real interest in clothing, that also kind of struck a chord with me. So my idea initially was to take these sort of useless or excessive items and to in some way kind of make their pointlessness manifest, make it physical. And so the decision that I made was to sew them shut, was to render them sort of inert or neutered, right? Functionless. So that in the same way that you encounter them in, on the ground, right, like here, this bag is not really serving a purpose, so too does this object serve no functional utilitarian purpose, right? As time moved on, though, I became more and more interested in the ways in which these things would be sewn shut. And that led to a kind of interest in things like crafts, technique, and then also building on my own background in painting, in color, composition, and pattern. And so the way that these things come into being are deliberately sort of heterogeneous. They sort of work in a variety of ways. So one of the the method that I often will use is a collage kind of idea, something borrowed from collage, where I'm sort of putting bits and pieces of different things together. Oftentimes, I will make something and then cut it up and recombine the elements in different ways. Go the right way? Yeah. And I'm also really interested in this idea of sort of DIY itself, do it yourself, as a kind of approach to both making art, but also to kind of living in the world. I'm really interested in the sort of way in which DIY proposes that sort of being self-reliant, teaching yourself how to do different things, in some way speaks to both the kind of commodified world that we live in, but also it's a way perhaps to think about lived experience as a sort of way of moving through the kind of alienation that we feel from most objects that we encounter in our daily lives. Oops. And to that end, I'm really interested in sort of working with these things in a variety of ways. So this is a bag which has been cut with a laser cutter, and basically it's a almost entirely sort of digital process. The bag is follows a sort of Illustrator file which cuts holes in the bag in this kind of particular pattern, and in that sense, the bag is not really handmade. It's made by a machine. At the same time, I'm really interested in something like this object, which is intensely sort of stitched, intensely sort of rendered by hand, and the way in which that sort of process could maybe or maybe not speak to industrial processes, such as the ones that surround me in my Brooklyn neighborhood. So like I said, I live in a neighborhood where industry is still very much sort of happening, where people are producing industrial goods. And so it's not unusual to encounter things like smashed glass on the ground. And this is a photograph that I took where I was sort of really curious in sort of comparing the way that the accumulation of tiny stitches speaks to one sort of process, a kind of more slow-going or deliberate or even obsessive kind of working method, versus the really, I don't know, random or destructive force of shattered glass, right? So how do those two kind of ways of, if you will, making speak to one another? Can they talk to each other? How do those processes work together or don't? Similarly, this is maybe a better example of what I talk about when I mean collage. So this is a few different, these are elements which are taken from several different bags that I've embroidered, and then they're cut up and sort of pushed or glued or melted or sewn together. So the objects really come into being sort of by a process of, on the one hand, kind of suturing, right? That's maybe done with yarn. It's also done with an iron. So I melt the bags so that they kind of stick together. And you get this sort of thing which is an amalgam, right? It's a sort of weird hodgepodge of different elements which are being sort of pushed together. You might think of it also in terms of like a repair, right? Many of these bags, because they're collected on the street, are dirty or degraded or damaged in some way. And in embroidering them, I'm sort of, in a way, symbolically making them whole again, right? There's another photograph that I took in my neighborhood, and again, what's sort of interesting to me here is this way that, on the one hand, you have this bag which has been sort of cut with the laser cutter, obviously a digital process, a mechanical process, versus these sort of beautiful weeds which sort of grow out of the cracks in the sidewalk. Likewise, there's also kind of interesting comparison that I like to think about in making these bags, which is the sort of idea of the yarn, which is obviously an organic substance, right? It comes from a living being, versus the totally synthetic substance that is the plastic bag, right? And these are a very sort of uncomfortable combination that is going on here, where I'm pairing something which doesn't necessarily speak to things which have come into being through sort of a life cycle, such as plastic, versus something that's very much close to us because it comes from an animal, right? And I like the idea that those two things don't necessarily sit very well together. You can see that a little bit more here. So this is a close-up of the surface of one of these works. And you can see that sometimes this stitching can get pretty intense, pretty dense. And again, for me, I think that the challenge in making my work is knowing when to stop. But because, like I said, I'm really interested in sort of excesses and waste and thinking about the idea of what constitutes too much, I'm always sort of, I'm always in a sort of place where there could be more. There could be more added. And the stopping point feels rather arbitrary at times. So my background, like I said, a little bit about where I come from. I'm from South Louisiana originally. And my grandmother ran a ballet company in South Louisiana in the 1960s through the 1980s, which was a pretty unusual thing to do in rural Southwest Louisiana. And in addition to choreographing the dances, she also made many of the costumes. And she became, because she was so passionate, so interested in this, she developed a sort of network where she would often have costumes passed down to her from much more sort of illustrious companies such as the New York City Ballet or the Royal Ballet in London, and then she would sort of rework them. She would, often these costumes would be broken or torn or damaged in some way, which is why the company was getting rid of them. And so she would, in some ways, sort of fix them, repair them, bring them back to life, which is what this is. It's a costume for Peter and the Wolf. And I think I probably get a lot of my magpie sensibility from spending a lot of time with these objects, right, which are glittery and shiny and very, very brightly colored. I'm really interested in theatrical costume because of the way that it sort of negotiates this kind of interesting kind of line between real life and something which is obviously larger than life, right? So it's both modest in the sense that it's got to cover the body of the dancer, at least to the sort of minimal extent that we require, but at the same time it's also supposed to be very dramatic, right? And something you want to look at, something you can't not look at in a way, right? This is another photograph that I took in my neighborhood, and so again, like I think one thing that's really interesting to me about costume and also fashion, which is sort of the subject of what my teaching here is really about, is the way in which fashion is the sort of discourse, a conversation that we all participate in, right? That maybe fine art is something which in many ways remains specialized or rarefied because you have to, attend an institution or be welcomed into a particular circle professionally. And yet at the same time, something like fashion or graffiti is a visual discourse that we all participate in. We can all sort of look at things and decide if they're appealing, if they're attractive, if they're interesting or thought-provoking. I think one thing that's really exciting to me when I talk about fashion, when I think about fashion, is the way in which it is such a kind of really great forum to talk about visual ideas, to talk about formal matters, And to think about, again, this idea of what is enough, what is too little, what is too much. That's a really, I think, complicated and fascinating question that we all have to negotiate every day, right? So again, here's another bag. This one has been spray painted, and as I said, I'm really interested in sort of applying lots of different techniques to these objects, and maybe trying to think about them in various ways, because the object itself is pretty much a cipher, right? It's a container, which means that by its very nature, it takes on the shape of whatever it is that you put inside of it, right? And so people will often say that these remind them of faces, or of animals, or of clothing, like I said. That's all intended in a way, right? Because the bag can really become whatever it is that you see in it, right? The other thing that sort of I've been thinking about a lot, maybe it relates to the first slide, is jellyfish. So jellyfish are one of the few creatures which are sort of prospering in our world of diminished resources. And one thing that's really interesting about jellyfish is that, like these bags, their shapes, their bodies are somewhat amorphous, right? They're totally mutable. They're not really fixed, right? They kind of change and mutate over the course of their lives. And so a bunch of these bags are named after different species of jellyfish. And like you know, the bags, jellyfish are also sort of eccentrically colored, really exotic to look at, pretty unusual looking creatures, which we in many ways don't know a whole lot about, right? So these are pictures of a show that I had just this past January in London, just to give you an idea of what they look like in the space. And so the bags are hung again like in a kind of staggered sort of way, where they, I don't know, hopefully begin to talk to one another, and specifically in sort of the terms of like what it is that I'm doing, right? So some things are more manipulated than others. Some things are not manipulated at all. Some things are totally transformed, and some things are left in a kind of raw state, right? And I like the idea that different kinds of labor, different kinds of effort could all be grouped together in one sort of place, in one exhibition, in order to think about like how all the sort of the continuum of sort of human activity maybe or maybe not speaks to a kind of knowledge of the hand. I'm really curious about the ways in which how you do things, how you conduct an activity, what we might call technique, can be perhaps a vehicle for knowledge or a repository of knowledge. That when you do something like spray paint on a wall, which is obviously really sort of quick, maybe even dashed off, or maybe not all that considered, does that represent some kind of intelligence in the way that, say, something like this would, which is more labored over, more deliberate, more carefully produced, right? So this is where I am now, which is that these things which were intended to be at one point sort of functionless or neutered have now really actually become some kind of a garment. They are sort of now becoming wearable. And I'm going to turn the lights on. So I've got some generous volunteers this morning to help me demonstrate these works. They are going to stand up guys, and wear them. And if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Yeah, take a turn around the room, guys.
Thought about context in which these would be
A context in which they would be worn. That's a really good question. A lot of this came out of a sort of concern, I guess you might call it, which was that the question that kept coming up was, what do these things do? And in a way, that's what I'm trying to answer, I think, here.
Is there very abstract?
Mm-hmm.
It's very sophisticated, conceived. It's hard.
It is, yes, yes.
Entry application. I see it's even more. Gives you a project for very day use resources. Children. But they have to be in a sense adapted.
Yeah,
in order to make projects.
Yeah, and I've done that. I've done workshops with students before. Obviously, we don't have the same kind of time available to do the sorts of things that I do in my studio. But at the same time, I think the sort of the gesture works in a certain way as well.
Where do you think you're going next?
Well, I think finding a context for this is a really important question. You know, do I want to make something more like a fashion show, and do I want it to be that sort of theatrical? Is a question that I'm sort of thinking about. I'm also thinking about, you know, ways in which to display these objects that maybe don't always have, where they don't have to be physically present. So documentation, I don't know. Yeah, I'm trying to, yeah, suss that out now. Yeah.
What about using yarn that's made from recycled plastic?
Yeah, I've done that. I mean, some of these are made with bamboo yarn, which is often something that's recycled. But and I'm certainly not against that. But I like the idea of, like I said, pairing something which is sort of discarded or maybe devalued with something which is actually precious, like yarn, right? Especially something like silk yarn, which is often what I use. So I like that kind of marriage of of these two somewhat unlike things going together. Yeah.
In making these, did you have like their end function as
Sort of. I mean, they're multifunctional in the sense that, like, yeah, it could be a hat or it could be a mask, but it could also maybe be, I don't know, a flower vase, an oven mitt, a sock puppet. It could be any of those things. And I don't know that, I guess maybe because I'm not a designer, I'm an artist, I don't have to sort of assign a specific function to them. Um, and I kind of prefer it that way. Yeah. Yeah. This is a gallery called Kate McGarry. Yeah, yeah. Well, I show my work periodically. Sometimes I'm fortunate enough to do it here, but I'll be in a show at the Islip Art Museum that opens in a few weeks out on Long Island. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And again, part of sort of figuring out like what these things do is figuring out what is the appropriate venue to place them in, right? So if you have any suggestions, I'm really, really eager.
Do you take your like color references or material references from historical or cultural things that you have seen, or where do you get a lot of your inspiration for the materials and the colors?
I would say that it comes from a variety of places. But like I said earlier, I think that for me, clothing is pretty interesting and pretty remarkable, and especially theatrical costume is really interesting. The class that I teach here is called Fashion and Modernism, and it's a sort of a seminar about the phenomenon of avant-garde artists designing clothes in the early 20th century. And what is sort of amazing to me is the sort of, on the one hand, this utopian impulse that these artists use, that they sort of imagined that designing clothes would somehow change the world for the better. And at the same time, it's kind of a terrifically, I don't know, absurd sort of gesture. But they were really interested in things like really bright colors, folk art, abstraction, technology, right? And those things are also very interesting to me as well.
That's really good. So, context. So I was just thinking that today, this day, yes,
Mm-hmm.
that context, fashion specialist,
Mm-hmm. 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 Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that begins with reconsidering what these things are, right? And that means not dismissing them, right? I mean, I think that's kind of the point in many ways of what it is that I'm doing, is that it's like there's all this stuff around us, and you could do stuff with it, so why not, right? I mean, that maybe in a way is a little bit utopian too, that notion. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I try something that shred.
Well, you have to. One thing that I do, like I said, I use an iron, which sort of makes the plastic a little bit more resilient, and so it's a little bit easier to work with when you sort of you give it more substance when you melt several layers together. Yeah, and then right, right. Not in all of them, but many of them. That's the case. Yeah, yeah.
I'm just curious. You seem like they've been so great.
That's definitely a possibility. I mean, the thing, because I do think about costume a lot, it's one thing that I struggle with is this idea of like design being subservient to a theatrical narrative. And I have to say that because I'm not a playwright, I'm not in theater, I'm not really willing to cede what I do to a storyline. So, yeah, that means that my options are maybe a little bit more limited. But no, I'm definitely interested in ways in which I can activate these objects in a live setting like this. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Is your grandmother still with us?
No.
Oh, so she never got to see it.
Mm-mm. Yeah.
I'm interested in the connection with ballet connection and the way in which ballet as a dance form actually amplify it's better forcing the body to.
Right.
And I'm interested in how these fit onto the body similarly in a way, or almost don't fit. And I'm just interested in your the relationship of these as you've made them in a way almost like sort of similar to refusing to conform to the body.
No, no, not at all. I mean, I think of ballet as an extremely abstract practice, right? It's this very far-fetched sort of ideal that the dancer is sort of aspiring to become or inhabit, right? That is very far away from the everyday actions, the everyday bodies that we all sort of move around in. And to that extent, something like a tutu is a tool to kind of make that abstraction either bigger, more appealing, more beautiful, right? But it is an odd circle of tulle that sits around your waist, right, at the same time. So absolutely, I want these things to abstract the body in the same way. And I would say that, you know, they are proposing a body which doesn't necessarily conform to the standard, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. I want them to retain the sense of being a vessel. Yeah. Yeah. Which is why I often retain the shape of the handles. I think the handles need to be visible in some way. Yeah. Yeah.
These things are
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know, I can see a movement piece that instead of coming up with these are applications for these would actually,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
from how
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's.
I'm literally my finger stuck. you know, it's, yeah.
Actually, I have a question that sort of relates to that. I was wondering, like, how the models feel wearing their pieces and how that might tie back to the idea.
Some of them feel that would, for instance, hats that come to a bit head. There's the masks are very
They're more malevolent. Yeah.
Yes.
Although it is, I mean, it's interesting to be in front of the audience and all. Because it's your shoulder piece here. It reminds me of your suit on.
And if we were playing with it in different ways,
That was what's in.
that's an interesting thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The Japanese armor.
Yeah.
Well, I think the idea that they could provide protection or even shelter is certainly inherent in some of the shapes. Yeah.
Like this one, the wedding,
Yeah.
what is that one doing?
What is it doing? It's guarding Jamie's baby.
I almost forgot that I'm wearing this one. I'm very aware.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in Panama, the indigenous people, all of the clothing, all had scrap fabric. So it's whatever scraps they can get, they layer them in this process that ends up creating composition.
Oh yeah. Well, I think what's kind of amazing is the way that many cultures share this kind of approach to reuse, and I think that that comes out of necessity, right? I think that where maybe I differ is that that's not the culture I live in. I'm not deprived. I don't live in a place where resources are scarce. If anything, it's the opposite. And so what I'm trying to think about is ways in which to deal with excess, right? What do you do when there's too much stuff, right? Yes, yes. All right, well, thank you so much. I want to thank my models, Nate, Amelia, Keiko, Elisa, Jamie.